good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people attending and participating in this hearing from multiple different time zones all over the globe, and we are very grateful for this uh, global participation in this globally significant dialogue. My name is Jeremy Miller. I am coming to you from the Black Alliance for Peace and the Steering Committee of the International People's Tribunal on United States imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and coercive economic measures, which is what this hearing is a part of. Today is our Eritrea nation hearing. Today, our topic, our task, our mission is to delve into the background, context, and impact of sanctions and economic coercive measures on the nation and people of Eritrea. We are very honored to have this task before us and participate in this way. We have three jurists for today's hearing, and that is Professor Mohammed Tay, Professor Eva Nanopoulos, and Charlotte Cates. These will be our jurists for today's hearing. It will be moderated by myself, again, Jeremy Miller, as well as my colleague, Professor Navid Farnia. And the hearing will be bifurcated into two parts. The first part, we will hear expert witness testimony, and the second part will be a question and answer period from our jurists as well as from other participants and attendees, including, of course, myself and Navid as rapporteurs. This is the seventh hearing in our tribunal process, which has been ongoing since February of this year. We are very excited. This is also a special hearing insofar as it's going to be quite expansive, and to this end, the Eritrea Nation hearing will be conducted today and tomorrow across 2 days, which is the first time that we have done that in the tribunal process. And we've done that because we have, such a wonderful amount of participation and people that are already prepared to testify and present information regarding our topic. I will leave the introductions there as we're starting a few minutes late, and just last minute housekeeping. The way that I will be moderating this first part of our hearing today, I will introduce our speakers as they speak. So I will introduce the individual, and then they will present their testimony. If you have interest or questions about the backgrounds of our jurists, this information can be found at the website for this tribunal, and that is a very simple web address. It's just www.sanctionstribunal.org. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome our first panelist today. Our first panelist today is Elias Amare, who is an Eritrean journalist, geopolitical analyst, editor at the publishing houses of Red Sea Press and Africa World Press. He is a founding member of the Asmara-based Peace Building Center for the Horn of Africa. Mr. Amare is a veteran political activist of the Eritrean struggle. Elias is also a Pan-Africanist deeply interested in the new Horn of Africa vision. He has lived and worked in Eritrea from 2001 to 2016. Elias, it is my great pleasure, to welcome you to this tribunal.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, esteemed jurors. We thank the organizers of the International People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and unilateral coercive measures for giving us this opportunity to bring the plight of our people, the case of Eritrea, in front of you, and thus through you in front of world opinion. Here, US imperialism is on the dock, on trial, and we, the people of the global south, and in particular the people of Eritrea, are bringing forth our charges for being victimized by sanctions, economic warfare, over a long period of time, going back to the 1940s. It is important to go back to the 1940s because without understanding the historical political background, you wouldn't have context to the present sanctions of the past 2 decades. And so we go back to the 1940s. Eritrea, like most African countries, was colonized by European colonial power, Italy, in 1890. And from 1890 to 1941, for a period of 51 years, it was an Italian colony. Then when the fascist Italy under Mussolini used Eritrea as a springboard for its grand vision to establish an Italian East African empire and invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the Allied Western powers were at first okay with that because they had hoped that Mussolini would be allied with them, but Mussolini made the fatal mistake in 1939 when he allied himself and fascist Italy with the Nazis, Hitler's Germany. And thus the British and the Allied forces all of a sudden woke up, and by 1941 they decide to kick out end Italian colonialism in the East African Empire. So Italian colonialism ended in Eritrea in 1941. Abyssinia, or Ethiopia, also, which was occupied for a period of 6 years by Italy, was also liberated. So in 1941, Eritreans had thought that colonialism had ended for them and freedom was being ushered in, but they were disillusioned to think that because the British soon started behaving like a colonial power. They call Eritrea, of course, the British military administration, but in reality, it was colonialism by other means. So from 1941 up to 1952, the British administered Eritrea. And here is where the first sanction begins, because sanctions are nothing but economic warfare, war by other means. So for their ulterior motives, the British start dismantling Eritrea's vibrant economy, because the Italians had left, an industrialized base, good infrastructure, agricultural schemes, and so on and so forth. So in order to justify their ulterior motives of dividing Eritrea, partitioning Eritrea, one part of it to be annexed by their colony of the Sudan to the west, and the rest of it to be given to Ethiopia, they decide to systematically dismantle Eritrea's economy. And thus the sanction, the first economic warfare against Eritrea started then. And at around the same time, 1941, US imperialism also sets foot in Eritrea alongside the British to continue the war efforts, because the US had entered war in 1941, Second World War. And under what's termed the Project 19, they had a small military base, aircraft maintenance station at a place called Gura. And they saw that Eritrea was strategically located. So by the end of the Second World War, Roosevelt, having met with Stalin and Churchill at Yalta, sails down on his ship to the Suez Canal to Egypt, and there he summons three leaders: King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, and King Farouk of Egypt. These were to be the allies of or client states of the US imperialism in that area. Iran has not yet, that time, the Shah had not ascended to power, still emerging after the Second World War. Probably Mossadegh would come. But in any case, Ethiopia was promised Eritrea as an outlet to the sea, and as a quid pro quo for that, the United States would be granted in Eritrea military base, and this was in the words of the infamous words of John Foster Dulles, who later became the Secretary of State under Eisenhower administration. He said in 1952, when the case of Eritrea was brought in front of the United Nations, from the point of view of justice, the opinions of the Eritrean people must receive consideration. Nevertheless, the strategic interests of the United States and international peace and security, this country, Eritrea, must be linked to our ally Ethiopia. That's what he said. And this was what happened to Eritrea. So, and thus a period of federation was ushered in the 1950s, from 52 up to 62. This was a sham federation in name only, but even that was abrogated by Emperor Haile Selassie, who unilaterally dismantled the federation in 1962 and made Eritrea his 14th province under the Ethiopian Empire. And thus the Eritrean people, having pleaded their case to the United Nations, the right to self-determination, when everything, all the peaceful avenues were closed to them, they take up arms. So the year I was born, in 1961, the armed struggle for liberation of Eritrea started. And for the next 30 years, a bitter war of national liberation takes place, with huge sacrifices, betrayals, shifts of power. And by 1991, the Eritrean people finally win their independence through the might of their arms, the militarily total military defeat of Ethiopian occupying army in Eritrea. And 2 years after that, in 1993, through a referendum, the Eritrean people's right to self-determination was declared. I mean, Eritrea was declared as an independent state and accepted as a member of the United Nations. So May 24, 1991 is when we count as our Independence Day. So this month, May, throughout Eritrea, there's a celebration of independence. And in 18 days, on May 24, Eritrea will be celebrating its 32nd anniversary of independence. This independence, a huge sacrifice was paid. 65,000 freedom fighters, combatants were martyred. And civilian death is estimated at over 100,000 people. Over 100,000 people were also made refugees in the neighboring Sudan and elsewhere in the diaspora. So from a population base of what was then 4 million people, an extremely huge sacrifice was paid. So by 1991, the 30 years war of independence have taken their toll on Eritrea. Massive displacement, huge sacrifice, and an economy that was completely destroyed. Eritrea was beginning from below zero, actually. So Eritrea again tightened its belt. The people understood that just like their struggle for independence, they would have to build their own country through self-reliance. What won them their independence, self-reliance vision, would also surely serve them in the reconstruction phase. The misfortune of Eritrea, though, is that when it became independent in 1991, the global level also, a unipolar hegemony of US imperialism was emerging because the Eastern socialist scum and Soviet Union had collapsed. And so there was no breathing space, room to maneuver, if you will. Eritrea had only a brief period of honeymoon from 91 up to 1997 to start the reconstruction phase, rebuilding its economy, its war-ravaged, war-devastated economy. But because Eritrea continued on its self-reliant path, an independent path of development, and refused to kowtow to the diktats of the World Bank, IMF, and Western imperialism, it soon became the threat of good example. And thus by 1997, when Eritrea had issued a proclamation to restrict the unfettered operation of NGOs, unheard of in Africa, this was not looked favorably by the West. And in 1998, a border war, the pretext of border war, was unleashed on it by the US client regime of the TPLF minority regime in Ethiopia. Bitter war fought from 98 to 2000, and in the end, the US intervened, became the mediator, and through a peace process, peace treaty was signed at Algiers in 2000, a comprehensive peace treaty in which the contentious border issue would be brought to The Hague, to an arbitration court, whose ruling would be final and binding, as per the Algiers peace agreement. So both countries, with their eyes open, signed this, that they would accept the ruling of the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission at The Hague in Netherlands, the arbitration court that is, and that its verdict would be final and binding. So the court heard the cases, the border, both countries presented colonial treaties, maps, witnesses, and what have you, and argued their case for 1 year. By April 2002, the arbitration court, the EEBC, Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission, gave its final ruling, in which the casus belli the town of Badme was awarded to Eritrea. This then, Eritrea, of course, as per prior agreement, the peace agreement of the Algiers, accepted it as final and binding, although some territory was also awarded to Ethiopia. But the Ethiopian regime reneged and refused to accept the ruling of the court. And thus, for the next 7 years, there was a seesaw in which Ethiopia tried to change this ruling of the court. And the guarantors of the peace agreement, the US, the European Union, the African Union, they all kept mum. I mean, they didn't pressure Ethiopia to abide by the final and binding court ruling. Ethiopia, when I'm saying Ethiopia, I'm talking about the regime, the TPLF regime, which was in power. And so finally, when the arbitration court, reached a deadlock, it gave a virtual demarcation and deposited this at the United Nations Cartography Department and closed its case, saying that it has finished its task. This is its final and binding ruling. But Ethiopia refused to vacate. The Ethiopian regime refused to vacate from sovereign Eritrean territories. And thus, a period of no war, no peace, in quotation mark, because it was not no war, no peace for Eritrea. It was beginning to face pressure and all kinds of maneuvers by the US. By 2007, when Eritrea saw that the United Nations Security Council would not pressure Ethiopia, the US would not pressure Ethiopia to evacuate from its territory, it then said that the United Nations peacekeeping force, which was in between the temporary military zone, had to evacuate from Eritrea. And thus that chapter was closed, but the hostilities continued. And in this period, 2006, Ethiopian regime also was pushed by the US to invade Somalia. And Eritrea again protested in the regional organization called IGAD, this flagrant violation of the sovereignty of an independent nation, Somalia. And for this, soon the pressure began to mount on Eritrea, and through various machinations, Eritrea was portrayed as a spoiler. The propaganda against Eritrea was heightened, disinformation, and by 2009, then US engineered sanctions were imposed on Eritrea at the UN Security Council. So this is a unique case of multilateral sanctions, but it was US engineered. How do we know that? WikiLeaks cables, thanks to Julian Assange and his comrades for bringing forth the communications, reveal clearly that the US administration officials, people like Susan Rice and others, were in cahoots, were conspiring with the Ethiopian regime, government officials, Meles Zenawi and others, to impose sanctions on trumped-up charges, on bogus charges. One, that Eritrea was helping the Al-Shabaab terrorists in Somalia, and two, they manufactured a border conflict again with Djibouti, a non-existent border conflict. And so based on this trumped-up charges, hastily, the regional organization IGAD and neighboring African countries were also drafted in this conspiracy to bear false witness against Eritrea, and sanctions were imposed on Eritrea at the UN Security Council. all Eritrea's appeals fell on deaf ears. And at that time, members of the Security Council, such as China and Russia, who should have known better, either abstained from the resolution or voted along with the United States and the Western powers. The only country at that time who voted no was Libya. And Libya soon after, 2 years after that, was invaded. So the 2009 sanctions imposed were again renewed in 2011. Ostensibly, on the surface, the sanction was an arms embargo in Eritrea. But when you have sanctions imposed on you, it becomes broader. It's broadened, and all kinds of economic sanctions, economic blockade could be imposed on such a country once sanctions are imposed on you. And so during this period, we witnessed, for example, when Eritrea wanted to buy tractors for agricultural purposes from a European country, Italy, 100 or so tractors. The negotiations went well and were about to finalize. And just when Eritrea was about to pay for the tractors, mysteriously, the deal falls through. Why? Because pressure is put on the company that wants to sell, that was going to sell the tractors. Elsewhere, water pumps also were faced the same kind of situation. Chemicals for pharmaceutical manufacturing pharmaceutical plant in Eritrea. Eritrea had started a small pharmaceutical plant. The chemicals for the drugs had to be purchased from outside. And then they say that this could be for dual use purposes. So spare parts for the electric power station, the same situation. They can be misconstrued as having dual purpose, military purpose.
Mr. Amari, I have to jump in here and let you know that we are at time, and so I'd ask you to please wrap up the presentation. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And so that is the background from which we have to see the sanctions, the unilateral sanctions that are imposed on Eritrea, and the multilateral sanctions. Those multilateral sanctions ended in 2018. But again, in 2021, because of a recent northern Ethiopian war of insurrection in Tigray, again, a unilateral sanction, US unilateral sanctions were imposed on Eritrea. So this is the context from which we have to see the Eritrean sanctions. And my colleagues will elaborate more on the details of this. And I will end my presentation here, but perhaps tomorrow I will have some time by way of concluding remarks at the end of the hearing. Thank you for listening, and I rest my case here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amari. For panelists, speakers, I would just little housekeeping note here. We understand that there's so much information that we need to present here, and we would ask that just in order to make sure that as much of it can be aired as possible, if we attempt to keep our testimony to between 15 and 20 minutes, and that will be great. We will make as much time possible for additional testimony, supplementary material, as well. I'm very grateful for again, Elias, for this opening. testimony. Our next panelist is a Dr. Saleh Mahmoud Idris Nabare, and he is head of Department of Language Education at the Asmara College of Education in Eritrea. Before his current position, he was head of the research unit in the National Higher Education. Saleh was the editor of over 40 textbooks for the Eritrea school system, scores of articles, and he has conducted over a dozen field studies and many more scientific research projects. Dr. Saleh, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this hearing today.
Thank you, Jeremy. Can you hear me?
Your audio is coming across perfectly. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. I would like to read my contribution so that I can save time. So, honorable viewers, please allow me to start by thanking you for taking your time to hear what I have to say about the impacts of U.S. unilateral coercive economic measures against Eritrea. I also wanted to express my heartfelt gratitude to the organizers of the hearing and for their tireless work who hold this important hearing. Thank you. As my colleague before had outlined it, the lives of 3 generations of Eritrea have been disrupted for the past 8 decades, from 1941 to 2023, because of the many declared and undeclared U.S. sanctions. To begin with, just after the World War II, out of the 50 or so former European colonies in Africa, Eritrea was the only one that was denied the right of self-determination and independence. This is the first and most costly U.S. sanction on Eritrea. It took tens of thousands of lives to reverse it. It took tens of thousands of lives to reverse it, I'm repeating it. On this injustice against Black African population, the U.S. was open and arrogant about its strategic objectives. In the words of former U.S. Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, in 1952, quote, "From the point of view of justice, the opinions of Eritrean people must receive consideration. Nevertheless, the strategic interests of the United States in the Red Sea basin and considerations of security and world peace makes it necessary that the country," he means Eritrea, "be linked with our ally Ethiopia," end quote. This summarizes the real reason why Eritrea was sanctioned or denied independence in the 1950s and why it has been under US sanctions for the past quarter century since 1998. Though different US administrations and their European allies have been given excuses to cover their terrible crimes against Eritreans, and the world have to believe that the sanctions were or are reactions to Eritrean government's behavior. The truth is that long before there was an Eritrean government to punish, long before the false accusations of interfering in Somalia were invented, and yes, long before the Tigray war erupted, there were US sanctions against Eritrea and Eritreans. There were sanctions against our right to self-determination and decolonization, against our right to education, against our right to lead a healthy life, against our right to have food security, against our right to development, against our right to live in dignity. And above all, US policies, actions, and sanctions had robbed us the right to live in peace in our neighbors or in our neighborhood. These continuous sanctions have affected us in many ways, and what I am going to list below is only the tip of the iceberg. But to begin with, let me just mention that I am one of those Eritrean children who were forced to pursue their education inside mountain dugouts and under tree shades with constant threat of aerial bombardments. After my hometown, Nakfa, was reduced to ruins by the war, I was forced to take refuge into the revolution school run by the EPLF in 1977. Many of the students there were orphans because our parents were killed by the Ethiopian army of occupation. We were hunted by jet fighters who rained upon us napalm and cluster bombs. These jet fighters were provided to the previous successive Ethiopian regimes, first by the USA and then by the USSR. Our mothers were knifed, our villages scorched, and our very lives were considered expendable. My own children were also subject to the same war trauma during the 1998-2000 Ethio-Eritrean War, in which the USA took side with Ethiopia, and the hardships of the 20 years of no peace, no war that was designed by the US, as I can speak about it in a few minutes. My grandchildren, the fourth Eritrean generation, should not live the same nightmare that their grandparents and grandparents experienced. We must do enough to let our children inherit a safe, peaceful world in which justice and the rule of law prevails. The degree of suffering may vary from one country to another, but I know many generations in many countries suffered of these unjust US sanctions. We owe it to our grandchildren to expose and challenge this unjust treatment of the people of the world by this greedy 1% of the world population in the USA. US hostile attitudes towards Eritrea was apparent as soon as Eritrea reaffirmed its self-reliant model of development anchored in social justice, participatory democracy, economic democracy, and religious harmony. This was made clear from the first day the Ethiopian regime under the TPLF declared war on independent Eritrea in May 1998. Dr. Haile Mazgabe, along with Dr. Asgeda Hagos, the two Eritrean Ethiopian members of the peace delegation that traveled to Addis Ababa and Asmara to lobby for peace between the two warring countries in June of 1998, remember David Sheen, US ambassador to Ethiopia at the time, telling them that they should give Eritrea 3 weeks and its economy will implode. This doom and gloom prophecy about Eritrea's economy has been repeated under different analysis packages from different Western capitals. One US ambassador wrote in March of 2009, the Eritrean government was one bullet away from implosion. In 2000, in the middle of Ethiopia's major invasion of Eritrean sovereign territory, Jane Pearl of the New York Times, interviewing Susan Rice, US Assistant Secretary of African Affairs, wrote, quote, "The diplomats say they are still talking to both sides, but they are also considering more severe sanctions like limiting the ability of the Eritreans to collect remittances from friends and relatives in the United States," end quote. As WikiLeaks cables reveal, Susan Rice had developed this initial goal of targeting Eritreans from 1998 to 2000 in her numerous consultations with Ethiopian leaders and diplomats leading up to the 2009-2011 US orchestrated UN sanctions. Quote, Prime Minister Mellas underscored to US UN Ambassador Rice during a 6-hour meeting, Isaiah's calculations would be shattered if the US and others imposed financial sanctions on him and particularly cut off Isaiah's funding from Qatar and other countries, and the most importantly, funding from the diaspora in the USA, end quote. As the WikiLeaks cables make it clear, the motive behind these illegal sanctions were and still are to effect regime change in Eritrea. Richard Reed, professor of African history in the Faculty of History and fellow of St. Cross College at the University of Oxford, also had to say this about the 2009 US orchestrated sanctions on Eritrea to his Wilson Center audience in Washington, D.C., January 2010. Quote, even though some voices in the UK Foreign Office were saying that this sanctions regime is disastrous idea, sanctions should not go ahead, the push was coming from above somewhere. Ethiopia needs to be right. Ethiopia needs to be the stable center. Eritrea will be punished. The US preferred Ethiopia for several reasons. Eritrea was seen as bunker state. They were less easy to control. Ethiopia had more reliable military perhaps. Their policy was more directable and perhaps predictable. Whereas Eritrea, from the mid-1990s, it was declared, or it was clearly seen as unpredictable and couldn't be relied upon to do certain things that Washington might have wanted to do, end quote. Now I will go to the impacts of these sanctions on health and education. First, impact on health services. On May 31st, 2007, the US terminated the HIV/AIDS prevention program in Eritrea. Two, Eritrea had difficulties importing vaccines and medicine because the carriers refused to transport the vaccine, fearing they might run full of US sanctions. For example, UNICEF was forced to charter a plane to deliver vaccines to Eritrea because the commercial carriers refused to transport them. There were times when Eritrea ran out of vaccines for these easily preventable childhood diseases. Because of the sanctions, the other pharmaceutical company cannot produce several of the medicines needed in the country, Eritrea. In addition, because of the sanctions, Eritrea cannot buy medical equipment from the West. First of all, companies, because of fear of violating US sanctions, are unwilling to sell medical equipment to Eritrea. Not only that, Eritrea cannot even get spare parts for life-saving equipment that were procured from the West. Furthermore, due to the sanctions, Eritrea's purchase of water trucks that were to deliver safe and clean drinking water to those that didn't have access in remote rural areas were blocked. Impact on Eritrean youth and education. Many young Eritreans were lured to leave their country under the false promise of luxury and easy life in Europe and America. In 2004, the US government employed the services of the UNHCR to encourage the entire Kunama-speaking ethnic group in Eritrea to seek and obtain asylum in the United States, to only throw them helpless in remote US corners without much help. February 2009, the Bureau of Refugee in the State Department announced that it had allocated asylum rights for 10,000 Eritreans youth who deserted the national service in Eritrea. In June 2009, President Obama signed Executive Order 1349, putting Eritrea in the League of Human Trafficking Nations and imposing series of financial sanctions against it. In reality, it was US administration that were willfully engaged in inducing human flight from Eritrea. In fact, President Obama, in his September 25, 2012 speech to the Clinton Global Initiative, boosted, quote, I recently renewed sanctions on some of the worst abusers, including North Korea and Eritrea. We are partnering with groups that help women and children step from the grip of their abusers, end quote. Directly, President Obama was admitting his administration's collusion in the human trafficking racket directed against Eritrea. Meanwhile, the UNHCR, in collusion with the TPLF-led Ethiopian government, conspired to resettle Tigrayans on theft of identities from Eritrean refugees and desert or sent in Eritreans to merciless waters of the Mediterranean Sea, and in the process, paying high prices to the network of human traffickers and smugglers directed by Tigrayan officials. According to the Austrian ambassador to Ethiopia, more than 40% of those who entered Europe claiming to be Eritreans were in fact Ethiopians. This percentage is even higher for the USA. Many of the skilled manpower in Eritrea, including teachers, trapped by these false promises of better life outside Eritrea. As a result, the education sector is suffering from acute shortage of teachers at all levels, from primary to higher education. About 300,000 school-age children are now out of school. The government is obliged to hire expatriate teachers at some high schools and colleges of higher education using badly needed hard currency because many of the Eritrean youths who were sent abroad to pursue their studies for their second and third degrees were encouraged or even in some cases intimidated not to go back to their countries. I experienced this myself when I was studying abroad. The tragic impact of the US-led unilateral and multilateral coercive measures against Eritrea have worsened the sufferings of the Eritrean population and delayed the development of its economy. But thanks to the resilience of the Eritrean people, the self-reliant economic policy of the government, and the independent political choice of the government of Eritrea, the Eritrean economy didn't collapse and the Eritrean government didn't implode as the US and its collaborators wishfully professed. Eritrea is moving forward slowly, but steadily. The Eritrean people is working together proudly and confidently for brighter future. This is the lesson that the other victims of the US sanctions can learn from Eritrea. It's true that injustice must be exposed and challenged, but at the same time, each new sanction must be taken as an opportunity for struggle and cooperation among those who are targeted by these injustice sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Selly. Our next panelist is Dr. Simon Tesfamariam, who is the Executive Director of the New Africa Institute. He has written and produced documentary films on a range of Eritrean issues, which include sanctions, healthcare, migration, human rights, economics, security, war, and media. He holds a medical degree from Duke University School of Medicine and has worked as an adjunct professor at the University of Asmara while living in Eritrea from 2015 to 2017. Dr. Tesfamariam, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this tribunal.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for this amazing, incredible tribunal. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to the jurors. Thank you for giving time to Eritrea and hearing out the Eritrean struggle and what the Eritrean people are facing. So I think it would be good if I just provide a little bit of background, just quickly to sort of get some understanding about the context behind the sanctions. So 91, Eritrean independence. 93, there was a referendum making it official, independence de jure. In 97, Eritrea became one of the fastest growing countries in the world, 8% growth. was pursuing an independent policy. And as our comrade Elias Amare mentioned, this was an very independent policy, wasn't taking the prescription of the IMF or the World Bank, and was pursuing an independent policy in the region. By 1998, seeing that this was perhaps a problem, they said that the border war was initiated by Ethiopia, as was later found out by the ruling of the Border Commission, which I'll get to in just a second. But they said that Badime, a town on the border, was Ethiopia's, and it actually turned out to be the delimitation decision and demarcation went for Eritrea. The town was actually Eritrea's. But anyway, a very important point that I want to make about this war, because it'll help contextualize sanctions, is that that war in 1998, between 1998 and 2000, between Eritrea and Ethiopia, was between the TPLF, was initiated by TPLF, led by Mullah Zenawi, Prime Minister Mullah Zenawi then. And he actually, in an interview in 1990 with Paul Hentz, who was the director of the CIA back in the 70s, before leaving when Mengistu came into power, with the fall of the emperor, and actually worked for the RAND Corporation, wrote extensively on US foreign policy. In this interview, Mullah said, "We look at this from the viewpoint of the interest of Tigray first, and then Ethiopia as a whole. We know that Tigray needs access to the sea, and the only way is through Eritrea. If you're wondering what Tigray is an ethnic region in Ethiopia, basically, in short, because we don't have enough time, this was essentially an ethnic secessionist war, and it had to break through Eritrea to get to the seas in order to create this independent Republic of Tigray. If you want more on this information, I suggest that you read The Cause of the Eritrean-Ethiopian Border Conflict, a 3-part series by the famed writer Alam Sagat Tesfaye, Eritrean writer. On December 12th, 2000, the Algiers Peace Agreement was signed. And basically, there were 3 bodies that were formed. There's the UN mission in Ethiopia and Eritrea, which was actually formed earlier that year. And then you had the Eritrean Ethiopian Claims Commission, and then third, you had the Boundary Commission. The Boundary Commission was supposed to demarcate the border. It was actually comprised of 5 individuals, 2 selected by each side, Ethiopia and Eritrea, and then the 5th one would be selected by both, agreed upon by both. And then however it was demarcated or delimitated and then demarcated, it would be final and binding. The decision on the border would be final and binding. That decision was given in 2002. And I should also note that the guarantors of that agreement were the United Nations, the OAU, which later became the African Union, the EU, and Algeria, where it was signed. And just a quick note on who the UN is, as John Bolton said, just for quick reference, there is no UN. There's only an international community that occasionally can be led by the only real power left in the world, that is the United States. So just for context, when we're talking about guarantors, when we're talking about the UN, we're talking about US having an important role in basically seeing a peace deal through. So that is signed by the UN. So 2002, the decision was given. By 2004, Eritrea went along with the decision because remember, it was final and binding. But what Ethiopia, what I should say is really TPLF at that time said, is that the border would be going towards that basically they would not accept the decision. They quote unquote accepted it in principle, which is really a rejection, because they said they wanted dialogue, that supposedly families are going to be split apart at the borders. But the truth is that you can't do that because the decision was final and binding. And on top of being final and binding, it was going to be the decision, as Article 4.2 of the Algiers Agreement said, it had to be decided ex equio et bono, which means according to what's right. It shouldn't be decided by ex equio et bono, which means according to the right and good. And so you can't make moral arguments about this family, that thing, or anything like that. You have to accept it as is, final and binding, because the EEBC comprised of 5 members selected by the countries themselves. So anyway, so then that meant, okay, and that was in 2004 when that kind of idea was pushed forward about dialogue. So that means Eritrea would be in an indefinite period of basically mobilization. And remember, Eritrea at the time was, Ethiopia was 20 times the size of Eritrea. Now that difference is even greater. And basically, what do you do as a nation? And in that process, I want to make very clear, remember, the US, the UN is a guarantor of this agreement, the EU and others. But we know that the US was actually working to delay, to stop this process, to continue this, what was called a no peace, no war situation. So as a 2005 WikiLeaks showed by Vicky Huddleston, the US was pressing hard to delay the UN resolution. And this resolution was to push forward on basically getting UNMI out and demarcating the border. And so then basically, and then we also have John Bolton expressing that one of the Assistant Secretary of State at the time for Africa, Jendai Frazier, reopened the border decision. And he admitted in his memoirs that her reopening of the decision was wrong, and that Eritrea had won, and basically Ethiopia had balked at the agreement. His words. So basically, the U.S. was taking an active role in delaying peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia, taking the side of Ethiopia. And so by 2007, there was virtual demarcation, which was the same demarcation that was used with the Kuwait and Iraq border. But Ethiopia refused to accept virtual demarcation. Eritrea accepted it, just in, taking the route of legality. And on July 2008, UNMI, the peacekeeping mission, which by the way was implicated by WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks by embassy cables revealed by WikiLeaks that they were involved in human trafficking. Just so you know this, in addition to many other crimes, which we don't have time for, but we can discuss another time. So again, this is a no peace, no war situation where a country is at war with a country 20 to 25 times its size. And at the time, President Isaias, actually in 2009, just to give you some perspective on the thinking in Eritrea at this time, during that decade when that had happened post-war, he said, "We decided early on not to be held hostage to this reality. Yes, we have a contingency. We would like to be vigilant all along. We'd like to be prepared all along, but we shouldn't be held hostage, meaning our human capacity will have to be engaged on some other productive activity." I'm not going to go on and read the whole thing for the sake of time, but basically the point is that Eritrea had to continue in this horrible situation of no peace, no war, but it would not be held hostage. So the country was mobilized in national service through the Warasai Ka'alo Development Campaign to not just, by the way, private capital was restricted to Eritrea, investment to Eritrea was restricted. So you're in this situation where you don't have investment, there's ongoing war. What do you do? And so Eritrea had its country mobilized in national service and civil service to deal with this situation. So moving forward, now that UNMI was kicked out of Eritrea in 2008, I should say that there was a UN resolution at that time that, what happened was that, so Eritrea basically, Eritrea was pushing for the guarantors to force Ethiopia to accept the agreement, which they would not do. And then Eritrea, seeing the situation, continued on its development path, independent national policy, independent foreign policy. And I mentioned the Warsai Kaalo campaign to develop the country. It also, at the time, kicked U.S. aid out of the country in 2005. It was, by the way, the first country in the world to kick out U.S. aid was Eritrea, and every country in the world, many countries after that followed in suit. But very important to understand is that Eritrea had to. There was a very deliberate isolation strategy against Eritrea, and the isolation strategy, according to Vicky Huddleston, is actually revealed by WikiLeaks in November 1st, 2005 cable. She stated that Ethiopia's strategy was to isolate Eritrea and wait for it to implode economically. And so basically, if you're fighting economic collapse and isolation as they had planned out for Eritrea, it has to pursue an independent foreign policy to break isolation. It has to pursue an independent national policy to prevent collapse in spite of everything that's being done to it economically. So in 2006, on Christmas Eve, Ethiopia invaded Somalia. I should say TPLF, which was leading Ethiopia, invaded Somalia. Under the cover of night, with no one watching at that time, obviously in the West with Christmas. So after they had invaded, many Somalis had regrouped in various places around the world, but one of the places was in Asmara. And so they formed the Alliance for the Reliberation of Somalia. Many of them were based in Eritrea at the time. And so then what happened is that Eritrea was then called a regional spoiler, quote unquote. Johnny Carson made the allegation, Jendai Frazier made the allegation. These were the assistant secretaries of state of the United States. So basically, just to kind of give you some background on what the US's policy was, I'd like to refer you to Richard Reed of SOAS University in the UK. He was speaking at the Woodrow Wilson Center in 2010. He said, it really would not have mattered that Eritrea, what Eritrea would have done. Eritrea is going to be punished. And then he continues, he says, Ethiopia needs to be right. Ethiopia needs to be the stable center. Eritrea is now becoming, to be blunt, a pain in the ass. It will be punished. The US preferred Ethiopia. It preferred Ethiopia for all sorts of reasons. Eritrea was seen as a bunker state. They were less easy to control. Ethiopia had a more reliable military, perhaps. Their policy was more directable and perhaps predictable. Whereas Eritrea, from the mid-1990s, it was clearly seen as unpredictable and couldn't be relied upon to do certain things that Washington might want it to do. So clearly, Ethiopia's foreign policy was pliable. The Ethiopian leadership was pliable to Washington, whereas Eritrea was not. And it was for this reason, as Richard Reed is admitting, who is very important Richard Reed is an important person in terms of Horn of Africa policy, in the think tank circles. But this is basically again, Eritrea is pursuing an independent foreign policy, and this was seen as a problem in Washington. So I can go on about many prior threats of sanctions. I'll not do that, but I just want to make the point that the multiple sanction attempts, unilateral, were made against Eritrea. And it was first hatched in 1999 when they made allegations of Eritreans providing support for President Hussein Aidid in Somalia. And then removing Eritrea from AGOA after a couple of years that was put into place, and they did that because of the citing the fact that Eritrea was placed on the countries of particular concern. And then I'm not going to go on just for the sake of time. But anyway, now I should mention one important sanction that was put into place. There was one multilateral sanction, UN Resolution 1640, which was put into place through the UN Security Council. And it made reference to Article 41 in terms of Eritrea. And if you look at Article 41 of the Charter of the United Nations, it says that it could take certain measures, and these measures were included partial interruption of economic relations and of rail, sea, air, postal, telegraphic, radio, and other means of communication, and severance of diplomatic relations. It doesn't explicitly say what to do to Eritrea, but it says you can include Article 41. So many people were not sold around the world that Eritrea ought to be sanctioned. And just to show you what I mean, you had the US literally game planning and manufacturing evidence against Eritrea, which was revealed by WikiLeaks. Can I ask how much time I have?
Absolutely. You have about 4 more minutes.
4 more minutes. Okay. So I'm not going to go fully into this WikiLeaks, but the point is that Europeans did not believe there was a WikiLeaks a cable from June 8th, 2009, in which they say from the cable out of Asmara, saying that the world is going to essentially deny that Eritrea has that Eritrea is funding terrorism. And so given the skepticism, we essentially need to push more. We need more evidence. And they go on to game plan how they're going to do that. And so then they also, and there's a 2009 WikiLeaks where they say, quote, European participants generally did not support sanctioning Eritrea. The Italian representative questioned whether the sanctions should be focused on spoilers in general and include other countries beyond Eritrea. The Swedish representative agreed that pressure would be more useful than sanctions. The UK representative agreed. Basically, a bunch of countries, one after another, agreed that sanctions were bad for Eritrea and for the region in general. And then that was 2009 when that was said, November, about a month before Eritrea was sanctioned. And then the day Eritrea was actually sanctioned on December 23rd, 2009. And it was, the way it was cast, by the way, was as a quote unquote African initiative. That's the words of Susan Rice, by the way. And she said that it was taken from the decision of the African Union, and the African Union actually took it from IGAD, which had a midnight meeting that summer in July, in the middle of the night, because there weren't enough heads of state. Actually, the AU chairman at the time, chairperson, Muammar Gaddafi, actually rejected the sanctions. Sensad, the Community of Sahel-Saharan States, rejected the sanctions. Yet Susan Rice, on December 23rd, 2009, said this was an African initiative. And so IGAD was actually headed by TPLF, which is in Ethiopia, and it had been consistently taking chairmanship for year after, consistently since 2007. It's supposed to be a rotating chairmanship, but they kept taking it every year. So you had basically this manufactured sanctions against Eritrea with the US and Ethiopia taking the lead on it, and basically boxing out African countries and then casting it as an African initiative. And so that was Resolution 1907. There was another round of sanctions in 2011, Resolution 2023. And the first round of sanctions, the UN sanctions, 3 reasons were given. The first was funding terrorism in Somalia, funding to Al-Shabaab, and then occupying Djibouti with the manufacturers. Comrade Elias spoke about the issue with Djibouti, this manufactured border conflict. They said that Eritrea was occupying Djibouti, which, by the way, was rejected by the French. And you also had the Djibouti Agreement, which was an alternative. They said that Eritrea was rejecting the Djibouti Agreement, and the Djibouti Agreement was an alternative process to the Asmara process that was taking place to reconstitute the Somali nation, to reliberate Somalia. So they said, you're not allowed to reject this other process. So you can't have an independent foreign policy, essentially. Just to
Dr.
quickly,
Tesfamariam, I just want to let you know we're at time now. Go ahead and please complete the thought, but I just let you know.
All three of those reasons were found to be false. The last one is a subjective thing because it's, you can have an independent foreign policy, but the first two, the arms to Somalia, 80% of the arms were found to come from Ethiopia and the TFG, which by extension means the US, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Yemen. 80% of the arms, and that was by an independent representative of the UN, of the Sanctions Committee of the UN, the Sanctions Committee of the UN, Dumasani Kamalo, I'll leave it at that. So I appreciate everyone for the time. I'll be very glad to answer more questions, answer questions in the end, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tesfamariam. Our next panelist is Grégoire Laliou, and Grégoire is a journalist. He lives in Belgium. In 2010, he traveled to Eritrea to participate in a documentary film on Eritrea entitled Eritrea, Come and See. He works for the alternative media Investig Action, which specializes in critical analysis of the media and war propaganda. Grégoire, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this tribunal.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be part of this hearing. So let's take a look at the role the Western mainstream media play to legitimize the sanctions against Eritrea. But first, we must wonder why the US decided to vote sanctions against Eritrea. Generally, and to put it shortly, according to the US, they vote sanctions against bad regimes to defend democracy and human rights. And in that case particularly, the US also blamed Eritrea for its intervention alongside the Ethiopian government and the Ethiopian army in Tigray when there was this TPLF armed uprising in 2018-2020. Now, let's go back to 2011. At that time, there were the so-called Arab Springs, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, different countries with different situations, of course. But there was also an Arab Spring in Bahrain. And what happened? Saudi Arabia sent its army to crush the peaceful demonstrators. Of course, the US didn't vote sanctions against Saudi Arabia. So the war crimes have been also reported in Yemen, and the US didn't vote sanctions. They even supported Saudi Arabia in that war. So the thing is, when we come to US foreign policy and US sanctions particularly, there is always double standard. If these sanctions are imposed to defend democracy, human rights, and to punish war crimes, well, the US could have imposed sanctions against themselves, as they committed war crimes in Iraq, for example. And there are a lot of examples of this double standard policy. In Chile, for example, Salvador Allende, there was economical sanction against his government. He was elected, by the way, but Richard Nixon, the former US president, he gave the order at that time, make the economy scream. which means makes the people suffer. Allende was overthrown, and then they supported the brutal dictatorship of Pinochet. So, US foreign policy and US sanctions have nothing to do with democracy and human rights. The former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, explained that once honestly when he said, "Great powers have no principles, they have only interests." So coming to Eritrea, why the US impose sanctions? Well, as an African country, Eritrea committed the biggest crime according to US imperialism. When Eritrea get independence, after the long struggle, the IMF and the World Bank, they came, they knocked at the door and they said, "Hello, we will help you to develop your country." And Eritreans, they said, "No, thank you, because who knows better than the Eritreans themselves what Eritrea needs." And if you look at the history of Africa, you could say that Eritrea was right, because Africa is the richest continent with the poorest people. Fortunately, things are changing, but Africa has been looted through colonialism, and the loot went on through neocolonialism. And the IMF and the World Bank, they are Trojan horses for Western neocolonialism. There is an excellent book of John Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He explained very well how this international institution, through their neoliberal programs and so on, they allowed the loot of African countries, open markets for Western capital, access to cheap raw materials, cheap labor, and so on. And in fact, Eritrea refused that. Secondly, the Horn of Africa is a region where there are a lot of turmoils. Somalia, Sudan, the war with Ethiopia, and so on. The Eritreans, they said, this internal contradiction could be resolved through cooperation and peaceful dialogue without foreign interferences. So this way, with all its resources and its strategical position, the whole region could develop and it will benefit to the countries in the Horn of Africa. It's a good vision. Of course, it doesn't fit with the picture of Eritrea in Western medias. And I guess it's hard to understand for those Western experts who have this colonial legacy in their mind and who think that these Africans, they are all savages who kill each other. But Eritreans, they say, let the Africans do, and we will do it well. This also is unacceptable for the US, who are involved in almost every conflict in the Horn of Africa, because the region is very strategical. And in fact, what Eritrea wants and what Eritrea proposes, it is the end of neocolonialism. So that's why there are US sanctions against Eritrea. Of course, these fundamental political aspects are never mentioned in the Western mainstream media. They still speak about human rights and democracy, but in fact, human rights and democracy are weaponized through war propaganda to justify sanctions against Eritrea. Michel Colomb founded Investigation, the alternative media I'm working for. As Jeremy said, we used to analyze war propaganda, Western media, and from this experience, and based on the work of a Belgian historian, Anne Lee, Michel developed the 5 principles of war propaganda. And now we will see through some examples that the way Western media covered the conflict in Tigray ticks all the boxes. The first principle is hiding the economic interest. The propaganda doesn't speak about the way Eritrea resists to neocolonialism. It doesn't speak about the way the US tried to control the strategical Horn of Africa, to control Africa, the Indian Ocean, and the Middle East. propaganda doesn't explain how the US used Ethiopia during the TPLF as an anchor state to control this region. Propaganda only speak about human rights and democracy. The principle, not the interest, refer to Kissinger. Second principle of war propaganda is hiding history. Who ignited this war in Tigray? We know that the TPLF attacked the northern commandment of the federal government the 3rd or the 4th of November 2018. The Ethiopian army then responded to the attack. A member of the TPLF Central Committee explained on TV that they launched a preventive attack. The day of this attack also, the former US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, made a tweet saying he was deeply concerned by reports that the TPLF carried out attacks on Ethiopian National Defense Force bases. The US think tank, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, even recognized that the TPLF led this attack to destabilize the Ethiopian government. Despite all of that, some Western media accused the Ethiopian government to ignite the war. For example, an article of the New York Times, the 26th of February 2021, mentioned, open the brackets, the war begun by Ethiopia. CNN and AFP also gave speech to TPLF militants who denied the fact that TPLF launched this preventive attack. They said it was fake news. The purpose is to present the TPLF as the victim. This is the third principle of war propaganda, reversing the victim and the aggressor. And it is linked to the hiding of history. If you explain how the TPLF ruled Ethiopia for almost 30 years, being elected with 99 or even 100%, if you explain how they put an ethnical federalism, applying the divide and rule strategy, how they worked as an anchor state for US imperialism, how corruption developed and how it was overthrown by popular demonstrations. If you also explain the plans TPLF had for a greater Tigray, then you can better understand why this party refused to cooperate with the Ethiopian government and try to destabilize it. Western propaganda doesn't mention all of that. There are only stories of good versus evil, and the bad ones do bad things just because they are bad. Of course, in that case, Ethiopian government and Eritrea especially are the bad ones. For that, you must forget that during this Tigray war, when Eritrean troops were not yet involved, the TPLF fired rockets at civilian targets in Eritrea. It was the 14th and the 17th, I think, of November, and Mike Pompeo again made a tweet at that time saying, "We strongly condemn the attack by the TPLF against Eritrea and the attempt to internationalize the conflict." So the third principle is demonizing the enemy. What you do and what your allies do is always good. If something bad happens, it is an accident because your intentions are pure. On the other way, what the enemy do is always evil. And if necessary, you can even invent bad things to demonize the enemy. Remember the Neria testimony and the incubators in Kuwait, the Milosevic Operation Horse-U in Kosovo, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, Gaddafi bombing the demonstrators in Libya, and so on. There are always things like that when there is a war. As you know, the first casualty when war comes is truth. In this war with Tigray, a pro-TPLF militia was accused of committing a massacre in Mekadra, the 9th of November 2020. the Western propaganda didn't speak very much about that event, a little bit, but not so much. And of course, the US didn't vote sanctions against the TPLF. On the other way, they spoke a lot of this Aksum massacre, which was an important element to justify sanctions against Eritrea. Of course, I didn't go on the ground to make my own inquiry, but we can see a lot of contradictions in what have been reported about that massacre. Just a few ones here. First, there are differences between different versions on when this happened and who committed the massacre. Sometimes it was Ethiopian soldiers, sometimes it was Eritrean soldiers. There are also different versions on who controlled the city when the massacre happened. Amnesty International finally published a report saying the Aksum massacre happened 28th and the 29th of November. The organization explained the interrogated survivors in a refugee camp in Sudan and by telephone in Aksum. But we know that in such inquiries, testimonies are not smoking guns. And TPLF militants, also refugees in Sudan, have been accused of misleading journalists, working sometimes as fixers or translators. Apparently, there were no mass graves, and the bodies were buried by the church, so it is even difficult to estimate how many victims there were. I couldn't pretend to explain what happened, but the most important thing here is that the US imposed sanctions without any form of trial and any real independent inquiry on the ground. The last principle of war propaganda is monopolizing the debate. One important thing here is that Western media rely mainly on pro-TPLF sources of information. You can imagine that ruling Ethiopia for almost 30 years as an US anchor state, the TPLF had all the time to develop connections with US administrations, media, experts, foundations, associations, and all the tools of Western soft power. For example, the Europe External Program with Africa published a lot of reports during the war in Tigray, reports that was used by Western media. But before that, its president called for regime change in Eritrea. The same with Eritrea Hub, an organization led by a former BBC journalist who participated to demonstration in London with TPLF militants against the Ethiopian government, and who even called to assassinate the Eritrean president. These are not neutral sources of information. To conclude, this last principle, monopolizing the debate, is an important issue. As a journalist living in a NATO member state, I can tell you that fighting against war propaganda is not easy. Sarah Flunders, I think she made an intervention to this tribunal. She wrote on a very good article a few years ago about WikiLeaks and internet. And she compared the internet to the creation of Gutenberg press. In the 15th century, that press broke the church's monopoly on information, and it brought revolutionary changes. Nowadays, the media industry used to have the monopoly on information. I recommend the book Manufacturing Consent to understand how it works. If you were a political dissent and you wanted to reach a lot of people through television, radio, or newspaper, you needed a lot of money. But suddenly, with internet, it was possible to create websites and to reach thousands and thousands of people across the world. Of course, now the GAFAM developed a monopoly on the internet. They are trying to close the window. And we know where is Julian Assange. So the fight goes on. And I think that from that perspective, this tribunal is very important because there are not a lot of debate on these sanctions. So I hope my contribution could help. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leleu. This was very informative and helpful, as has been all of the testimony here today so far. It is now my duty and pleasure to introduce our final expert witness for today's hearing, and that is Mr. Mohammed Hassan Ali. But before I introduce Mr. Ali, I would like to just do a little housekeeping. After we conclude the segment of this hearing where we hear from our expert witnesses, the moderation will be taken over by my colleague, and that is Professor Navid Farnia, and he will be leading the moderation for the question and answer period. For those who maybe tuned in mid-hearing or so, we did start today's hearing about 15 minutes later than we anticipated due to some technical difficulties, so we will be running it a little bit later than originally anticipated, so as not to cut too much into the time allocated for the question and answer period, and we hope that you all can stay on with us through that process. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce again Mohammed Hassan Ali, who is a former Ethiopian diplomat in Brussels and Washington. He's a former member of the Labour Party of Belgium, responsible for the education department, a specialist in the Horn of Africa and the Arab and Islamic world, a historian, teacher, and activist, one of the foremost geopolitical analysts of the Horn of Africa, president of the Horn of Africa Television, and Mohammed is a long friend of Eritrea whose solidarity goes back to the early 1980s and has written numerous articles on Eritrea, Ethiopia, and the Horn of Africa. Mohammed, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this tribunal.
You have to unmute yourself, Mohammed, comrade.
Thank you very much to invite me and to listen to my story. As the former speaker said, that I'm from Ethiopia, and I have been a diplomat for Ethiopia from the 1990s until beginning or end of 1994. I was privileged to be closer to the leadership of Ethiopia at that moment. Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, when he was young and I was young, we had been militant together. In fact, I have organized the biggest demonstration in Ethiopian history, which is called the Ethiopian Muslim demonstrations. Under the emperor, my country, Ethiopia, which probably that 50% of the population are Muslims, they were not citizens of Ethiopia. We Muslim Ethiopians, we were considered, we are foreigners. The radio, the television, when our holidays comes, it announced that Ethiopia, Muslims who are living in Ethiopia, tomorrow they will celebrate their holidays. That puzzled me as a young boy. I asked my father, how is possible? 50% or even more of the population are foreigners. He used to tell me, Don't think about that. This is an invention to support an archaic regime by Western historians. Like Edward Said says, Eurocentrism. As if my country, Ethiopia, surrounded by Muslims, an island of Christians. It's a lie. And these historians who wrote those books are famous American historians and an American best universities and Western best universities in Germany, in Sweden, Robinson, and so on. 1991, when the change came, we hoped, all of us, the people of the Horn of Africa, we will have peace, tranquility, and we will start a new start. From this view, I joined the Foreign Office. After working 1 year, I noticed the mood of the country in Ethiopia is changing. I was recalled to the headquarters. I came, and there was a lot of so-called free press in the country, written in Amharic. And this free press was writing a lot of negative things about Eritrea. I was surprised. We are supposed to work with the Eritreans. We see Eritrean delegation coming to Addis, Ethiopian delegation going to Asmara. The official policy, we are supposed to sell it in the market, in Brussels and everywhere, that we are working together. But in the country, continuous propaganda against Eritrea in the free press. So I went to my minister, the late minister, Seyu Masfin, and I asked him how we can work in this double policy. The free press is writing and breaking the concept we have, the good neighborhood, that we can work together, and from there also we will try to bring the Somalis, solve their own contradictions, and gradually establish a new Horn of Africa. And he just looked at me and he said, don't go. Stay for 1 month, 6 weeks, collect this information and write me a report. I collected the information and I wrote him a good report. When he looked at it and read 3 pages, the first question he asked me, how many people read this report? I said, nobody except me and your secretary who typed it. Then he said, let's go to the president. By that moment, Male Zenawi was the president. So we went to the president's office, we greeted him. Male Zenawi hugged me. We know each other for a very long time. His aunt, she was my neighbor. Then he said, have a seat, Mohammed. And my boss left us alone, and I gave him the paper. He quietly read it. It was 67 pages. When he finished it, one question he asked me, is there anybody read this report? I said, nobody. I am the writer, the secretary of the late Seyu Masfin, Minister of Foreign Affairs. She is the one, she typed it, and Seyu looked at it. He didn't even read more than 10 pages. Very good, he said. He smiled. Put it aside. And he looked at me, stared at me. He said, I liked it. Because this thing, we should not talk about it. After a while, I got an information is that the information to the so-called gutter press was given by the intelligence service of Ethiopia. It is the process of starting and dehumanizing Eritrea. When you go to the reception in Addis Ababa, in the diplomatic reception, the Western diplomat, they will come and they will whisper in your ear. The relation between Ethiopia and Eritrea is not straightforward. The people of Ethiopia, they don't know anything about it. But because I was well versed and I knew both organizations earlier, something is cooking. US and its allies, one of the major agenda they disliked, what Eritrea calls a policy of good neighborhood. Eritrea initiated an organization which had been paralyzed, reactivate the IGAD, and through that, establish a new Horn of Africa. Good neighborhood, a new Horn of Africa. And this new Horn of Africa can be only completed when we try to resolve the Somali issue. We, Eritrea, Ethiopia, neighboring countries, we should facilitate the Somalis to discuss among themselves. In the process, with internal interest, but major interest of US imperialism, it have hijacked TPLF and they put TPLF leadership in the pocket, encouraging TPLF to be the main actor in the Horn of Africa. The ego of TPLF increased. These rumors and small propaganda promoted that as if Meles Zenawi is the brain of the Horn of Africa. My second experience for the jury, I was appointed in a good time as a diplomat in the United States. In fact, I was appreciated by TPLF leadership and the president, later on prime minister. I came to Washington. Before I was coming, I had a comrade from Zanzibar, a very famous Pan-Africanist who passed away, Abdurrahman Babu. I told him I'm appointed in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to Washington, D.C., because I have arranged for him a trip to come and visit Ethiopia. Then he said, oh, Mohammed, my son, I will give you a letter to a former friend of mine, which is he is an advisor to President Clinton, Anthony Lake. Came to Washington with a letter of the late Abdurrahman Babu. I was a young man. I called to his office. I left a message. And after a few days, I got a call from his office. He sent me a car. and I visited him and I gave him the letter. And he said, my son, how are you? Have a seat. He gave me coffee. While a little bit we were talking, he liked me as a person. The age gap was big, but I was talking straightforward. Then he told me, you know, we have a view for Africa and a vision. What is that view? We in the United States, we have divided the continent in 4 anchor states. And through these anchor states, we can implement and influence the African continent. I asked him, could you explain? He said, yes. From Egypt until Mauritania, to North Africa, the anchor state will be Egypt of Mubarak of Egypt. For the Horn of Africa, for your region, he said. Ethiopia, led by TPLF, will be the anchor state. For South Africa, he told me. By that moment, President Mbeki was elected. South Africa will be under President Mbeki. Through South Africa, who will influence Southern Africa and West Africa, Nigeria. In the same year, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense of the United States, published a policy paper for the first time on the African continent, putting the map of Africa, all wells of Africa, and they say, Pentagon says, Africa will be the most important continent for us to choke our competitors. By that moment, it was no China, there is no Soviet Union had collapsed. Our competitors, they say, is Japan. To make a long story short, the quarantining of Eritrea had started from 1993. First, character assassination, putting everything in one individual, the president of Eritrea, minimizing and trying to blacken the image of Africa, first in Ethiopia and in the Horn of Africa. The narrative Eritrea was promoting must be crushed before it reaches to the ear of the masses in the Horn of Africa. Once you prepare psychologically an extreme right-wing intelligentsia who will be an anti-Eritrean by position, then gradually also you will encircle Eritrea within a regional. Eritrea was provoked and left the regional organization, which was the Secretary General of that regional organization, was an Eritrea. That organization was taken by TPLF, associated with Djibouti. Slowly they developed a theory in encircling Eritrea with a new idea which is called the Sana'a Group. The Sana'a Group, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Yemen. Sana'a is the first meeting they did in the capital of Yemen. To choke Eritrea, to quarantine Eritrea in the region, diplomatically, propaganda-wise, socially, and so on, and military if it is possible. All this for 3 major Eritrean independence policy. 1, good neighborhood. Second, self-reliance. Me and my comrade Gruwar, we had more than 3-hour interview with the president of State of Eritrea, President Isaias Afwerki. And he told us frankly, we have that as an exhibit. Isolating the region and Sudan. The Islamists in power in Sudan, the ethnicists in TPLF in Addis Ababa, the Balkanized and warlord area of Somalia, and Kenya was put in the pocket, and Djibouti is one-man show, and Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh. This is the second state. The third, which pushed for and forged accusation against Eritrea for sanction. Eritrea's crime is simply when the TPLF invaded with the blessing of United States, Somalia, those who fled away from Somalia and who wanted to resist against TPLF occupation, they came to Eritrea, invited, Eritrea received them. In fact, most of the hotels in Asmara was occupied by Somalis. The vision Eritrea have, let Somalis speak among themselves. We cannot help them. We are not going to give weapon that Somali brothers, they go and kill each other. The only thing we can do on the policy of good neighborhood, we will allow them, let them stay here, let them discuss, even if it takes 6 months, 1 year, we don't mind. We will pay the expense. And the president frankly told to the people who came, more than 700 Somalis came there from different fraction of political or different forces. This angered US imperialism. And it is lucky it's in the region and European Union. Finally, they hijacked and they brought it to Djibouti and they established a so-called federal government. And then they continued the propaganda seriously on Eritrea. So the two pillars, good neighborhood, national independence, self-reliance. The third important pillar, which they have demonized it, is when Eritrea initiated 1994 national service for its youth who are finishing secondary school and they will have the exams and so on. This also is dangerous according to them. The vision of Eritrea was to build a nation state. There is 9 languages spoken in Eritrea. There is several religions in Eritrea. These young people are born in different homes and so on. And once they grow up in adolescence life, they have to meet their other compatriots. And that Sawa, which is they call it Sawa, the Eritreans, is a meeting place. I wish that Ethiopia, my country, had that. And this also, they consider it a very dangerous. It will strengthen Eritrea from inside. It will create a vision for the new generation that Eritrea will build itself with another basis, on the basis of a multicultural, multi-religious society. This also is considered a crime because finally, Eritrea is a rotten apple which will contaminate the other good apples in the basket. Regime change, or it have to be removed. And the vehicle to remove Eritrea, one is sanction and false pretext and a direct war. As Gruwar, comrade of mine, explained, this war is incrementally increased. But what shocked US imperialism, the unintended consequence which happened in Ethiopia. The popular revolt who have rejected the minority regime who doesn't even constitute 6%, and they are not even representing the people of Tigray. By popular revolt, 4 years, it collapsed. A new relationship now in the region starts developing. The peace agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea, then later on, the tripartite agreement between Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. This brought a lot of nervousness in Washington. The only option they have to wage a war, simultaneous war against the government in Addis Ababa and against Eritrea. And finally, the result of it, our brothers and sisters in Tigray paid the biggest price. This is our brothers and sisters. We have to live with them. We have to work with them. But they were used as a Wagner army for an enemy is very far, 30,000 kilometers from us. Destroyed Tigray. Tigray is destroyed literally by United States. Encouraged it, supported it, gave it diplomatic cover, media cover. Very strangely, after Tigrayan people that huge price because they couldn't understand that the so-called TPLF. Now they are in the most miserable condition, including USA, have stopped now supporting the people of Tigray. These hypocrite forces, they are very good in manipulating things. We will hear from now on to conclude. And I ask member of the jury, Eritrea's crime, one, peace. After 80 years of balkanization and war and conflict in the Greater Horn of Africa. Second, Eritrea's vision, cooperation with all states and people. Third, self-reliance, because we have the resources and it is possible if we mobilize the majority of the population of the Horn of Africa, we could change and the result will be visible very soon. So the enemy who has sanctioned Eritrea, I traveled every time to Eritrea and I see the steadfastness of Eritrean people, despite the difficulties the sanction brought, they stood up tall. To conclude, imperialism never understood of the four major characteristics of Eritrean people and Eritrean revolution. The first one, they know where to go. Nobody will plan for them. They plan it themselves. The second, they have no complex, the Eritreans and the Eritrean system. They are willing to listen any good advice. They are not stubborn people. If you bring a good advice, whether you are from the earth or the moon, they will listen to you. And if it is going to help them, they will use it. The third, which they will never accept, that somebody will try to change their line and intervenes and says, no, you are wrong with this line. You have to accept World Bank vision and change, so that they will never accept. And the fourth, the most important one, patience. I call it in Arabic, Sabr Ayyub. They have big patience. And patience will win. And that it have proved. And thank you very much for listening to me. I hope this People's Tribunal will expose the crime committed against the Eritrean people, not only Eritrean people, also the whole region. We suffered a lot, but thanks to steadfastness of Eritrea, at least we see from a dark, there is a light shining. And that light, they went to pick it off. Thank you very much.
What a powerful note to end on. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad Hassan Ali, for this powerful testimony. Thank you to all of our expert witnesses. At this point, it is my pleasure to transfer moderation over to my colleague, Professor Navid Farnia, for our question and answer period. Navid.
Thank you, Jeremy, for the transition, and a special thank you to all the expert witnesses for this wonderful testimony. Just a reminder before we get to the jurists and their questions, just a reminder to the audience that the second half of our Eritrea hearing will be tomorrow at the same time. So I hope you can attend that as well. So let's now transition to the questions, question and answer session, and particularly I want to get the jurists involved. And so I want to start with Eva Nanopoulos. Any questions you have? And also, for those of you who are in the audience, if you want to know more about our jurors, their profiles are listed on the Sanctions Tribunal website, which Jeremy mentioned earlier, sanctionstribunal.org. So Eva Nanopoulos, do you have any questions for our witnesses?
Yes, thank you very much. First, I mean, what a wonderful set of witness statements. Thank you so much to everyone, because I really learned a lot, and it highlights again the importance of knowledge production, of collective knowledge production of that kind for what we're doing. I have several questions, but I don't want to monopolize all the time, so I'll ask maybe a couple, and then I understand that we can submit further questions in writing. But perhaps the first witness first, Elias Amare, you mentioned in the beginning the British sanctions. I mean, the whole sort of period of the 40s, etc., where you said that there was a first attempt really to dismantle the Eritrean economy. Can you say a little bit more about that period? And am I right that you said the British then imposed sanctions? And what was the role exactly of the sanctions there in terms of dismantling the economy? What did they want to achieve more specifically?
Very good question. Thank you, Eva. Well, historians or experts of Eritrean history say that the British realized that their star was waning at the time. The British Empire, you know, remember the sun never sets on the British Empire. That thing, the sun was setting on the British Empire. So they had Sudan as their colony. So, and from Sudan, they had great 10% of the British treasury used to come at one time from the Jazeera project of cotton agricultural scheme. So the western part of Eritrea, they wanted, which they called a Muslim lowland, to divide it, to partition it, to unify it with their colony Sudan. And the highland part, they call the Christian highland part, to partition it to Ethiopia, and thus leverage, you know, some access with Ethiopia. So in order to do that, they had to say, well, one, the Eritrean people are not one, they are not unified, they are divided. The nationhood of Eritrea is non-existent. Muslims, Christians, lowland, highland. So that divide and conquer strategy was there. At the same time, because Eritrea's economy in the region was advanced, I mean, the Italians had invested a lot in Eritrea, Eritrea's infrastructure, its railway system, cable, what's called in Italian teleferica from the port to Asmara, non-existent in Africa at that time, highly industrialized, working class was blossoming. So they wanted to crush this in order to justify that the Eritrean economy is not viable. Eritrea is not able to support itself, and thus it had to be, partitioned. It was what was called the Bevins-Forza plan at the United Nations. Unfortunately, that didn't win. I mean, the Eritrean people at that time in 1940s, despite being a small population and having been under Italian colony, brutal fascism for over 50 years, quickly realized this sinister, devious plan of divide and rule. And so Muslims and Christians unified and said, we are one. There was an incident in Asmara, in fact, that the British instigated a massacre. They wanted a bloodbath in Asmara between the two followers of the two religions. But the Eritrean people quickly realized this sinister mechanism, and they, unified and made sure that that kind of division would not come to fruition. But the second one, dismantling of Eritrean economy, they did systematically. They looted the port and sold parts of it to Pakistan or what have you, or took it to their other colonies. They systematically hampered the industrialization of Eritrea. And thus, in this way, what followed at the United Nations, that Eritrea cannot become an independent nation, that was the misfortune of Eritrea. And before the decolonization started in the rest of Africa, by the end of 1950s, Eritrea was one of the first, and at that time, the anti-colonial movement had not started. And thus, in a way that sanctioning, if we consider sanction as economic warfare, that was the first sanction on the Eritrean people. And to some degree, they succeeded because Eritrea was first, attached to Ethiopia under a sham UN federation. And then that federation was systematically destroyed, dismantled by the feudal monarch of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie's regime. In 1962, against UN resolution, the federal arrangement was, nullified and Eritrea annexed. But the Eritreans, having realized that they were going nowhere, they said the only solution is to take up arms. So in 1961, again, the year I was born, that was when the Eritreans started the armed national liberation. So you can say that my entire life has been, an experience of imperialism and resistance of it. That's the story of my life, you can say, and the story of Eritrea in a nutshell. I hope I have answered your question, Eva.
That was very helpful, because I can see connections to what others have subsequently said in terms of trying to sort of, if I understand correctly, the sanctions were really there to prevent the Eritrea dream of unification, but also economic self-sufficiency. So if I understand you correctly, we can trace it back to that period.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. I'll leave the opportunity to others. I can come back with other questions, but I think a lot of people have very much to ask everyone.
So yes, Professor Nanopoulos, we'll probably come back to you. I want to give Charlotte Cates the opportunity to pose any questions that she has at this point. Charlotte?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to all of you for your detailed and informative presentations about this very important issue that gains relatively little attention in the Western media, particularly in the United States, despite the fact that the United States is responsible for so much harm coming to the people of Eritrea. I wanted to ask for any of your thoughts on the impact of what we're seeing now regarding de-dollarization and alternative payment systems being set up internationally, particularly because of the attacks against Eritrea in terms of excluding it from the SWIFT interbank transfer system and attempts to shut down Eritrea's ability to participate in international trade. That given that there has been a recent trend that's been escalating, particularly in the past year, towards de-dollarization, towards setting up independent payment clearance systems internationally, what kind of an impact has that had on Eritrea, and how do you see that trend moving forward?
I will let my other comrades answer that so that I don't hog all the answers. Maybe Simon, can you take a crack at it? Comrade Simon?
Sure. So I actually was just recently in Eritrea, and one of the things that I've heard from a number of complaints, in trying to find these creative ways of getting around the sanctions, or I should say, dealing with the sanctions, people have entertained the possibility of using cryptocurrencies and this kind of thing, and I heard that like in multiple ways on these exchanges, these wallets, they're excluded. In fact, they get a letter, an email, that tells them that like, you're now suddenly, we have to cut you off. And when they call and they try to find out what's going on, they're told that they basically were told by the U.S. to stop, the U.S. government to stop, to shut them down, to shut down those specific accounts. So I can add that one new sort of feature. But I think this is an area of greater exploration. And if there's any follow-up in the future, I'd be very interested in submitting documents and having further discussions and investigation into this stuff. So, yeah.
May I join?
Of course.
I think is the major strategy of US imperialism is not on trade, foreign trade in our region. Their major strategy is that no trade between Ethiopia and Eritrea, no trade between Sudan and Ethiopia, no trade between Somalia and Ethiopia, no trade between Kenya and Ethiopia. Can you imagine? Kenya is one of the biggest economy in the region. There is no trade between Ethiopia, which is a country of 120 million, and Kenya probably is 50, 55 million. There is no $100,000 trade between these countries. The main purpose is to block the internal market. And to open the internal market, you need a good neighborhood political understanding. Imagine Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, Djibouti, Sudan North and South will have an open economic relation. In one case, you will be surprised what kind of a change will bring. To give an example, when Africa was getting independent, and particularly in Eastern Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. I'm sure that most of you are young and you didn't see what kind of situation after independence was created in these countries. There was a union which is called the East African Union. The airways, it was called East African Airways. They had one central bank. Trade was open. Population can move from one place to another place, even much advanced than the so-called, now which became the European Union, which they call it Marché commun or the common market. Who destroyed it? British and US imperialism, by engineering a coup d'etat in Uganda, bringing Idi Amin in power. East African Union was shattered. They had a very strong surplus currencies. They trade, citizens move from one place to another place. They can work. That example imperialism have. Imagine if the Horn of Africa, with the idea that independent concept of Eritrea added to it, I will assure you, in half a decade, these areas can produce a lot of food to the world. With the resources they have, they will improve without even begging anybody the life of their own population. So somebody is putting hold up on the region and is blocking the integration of the region. After that, we could have spoken to conclude, member of the jury. Eritrea and Somalia together, we have 5,000 kilometers square from the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. You don't think that Eritreans and the Horn of Africa people and the kids who go to school every day, we cannot give them every day 1 kilo fish with the resources we have? I'm asking to the member of the jury, please check the debate which has happened in Spain when the Spain fishing companies came to the Indian Ocean because Somalia didn't have a naval force and Somalia was balkanized by warlords. They were looting the Somali fish and dumping chemicals. Nobody spoke. South Koreans, they were fishing in the Somali territory and they didn't even pay $1. These are warlords with ties, well armed until their nose, and bullying the region. If we had peace, we will surprise the world. And that is what, whether it is sanction in banking or sanction in cooperation, the biggest sanction what they did on us is that we don't cooperate. They just put us like a zoo, quarantining us, one cannot speak to the other, and so on, and create a condition where it is this policy of the Hollywood, the bad and the good and the ugly policy they implemented on us, and we are suffering for the last 60 years. Thank you.
Thank you
If
for
I may
your
add briefly on the de-dollarization issue, it was a good question that Charlotte raised. An indication of that to me was the outburst by, if you will, the berserk reaction of the senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, when he heard that President Lula of Brazil going to China, and he was openly talking about moving away from the dollar and trading with each other through their own currencies, the Brazilian, peso against the Chinese yuan. He said, if this de-dollarization thing trend continues, my God, how are we going to sanction them? He blurted it out. Thus, there you have it, the answer in a nutshell. is that the supremacy of the US dollar, its dominance of as the world's currency, global currency of trade, dominance of the international banking system of exchange through the SWIFT mechanism enables it to sanction anybody, and thus the trend of de-dollarization is good news for the global South countries, for those who are suffering from, the onslaught of economic warfare by the US through so-called sanctions. Sanctions kill, and they are economic warfare. And one instrument of that is through the dominance of the dollar system as a world trade currency. And that's all I can say. We will see where this trend is going, but it seems to me that the trend is growing. The unipolar hegemony is in decline. Multipolarism, or Comrade Vijay Parshad does not like that term multipolarism. He says multilateralism, and I kind of agree with him, because polarism means conflict. So a growing multilateralism and trading through different currencies, I think, is good news for the world, for world peace, and for world economy.
I'll also say that I'll add one thing, that Brad Sherman, congressional representative from California, has made some very aggressive statements, seemingly out of desperation, because he says that sanctions don't work when it comes to Eritrea. They don't work, and what he really means is the sufficient kill rate is not high enough for him, and because of this, he says that because the sanctions don't work, that we should go the route of naval blockade of Eritrea in the Red Sea. And just consider with what's going on at the current moment in Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, things are getting very hot. We've had a couple of setbacks in the region, and because of this, in the chaos, as we saw in the chaos of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, in Egypt, all of a sudden in the chaos, Libya, they went after Libya. And so, you just don't know what in their desperation, what they'll do with the changing world, and feeling as though they don't have very many options left, that, they could go that route, because the Red Sea basin, Nile basin, is such a critical geopolitical, part of the world. And so, just prepare for any eventuality. And I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Thank you so much for these robust responses. At this point, I want to also ask my co-moderator, Jeremy Miller, if you want to jump in with any questions that you have.
Yes, thank you, Navid. I do have a question, and I think maybe I'll bifurcate it into two parts. Maybe curiosity about the historical aspect for today's hearing, and maybe we can dig a little bit deeper into the current aspect tomorrow. But my question revolves around the relativity of sanctions to military resentment, that is specifically to Eritrea's refusal at different points in history to play ball with United States ambition for full spectrum dominance, or global imperial military supremacy. And I'm specifically curious, this came up in our Libya hearing about the relativity between sanctions on Libya and resentment over the closure of Wheelis Air Force Base in the Tripoli area, which was at that point in time, for most of its existence, the largest U.S. military installation outside of the United States. And of course, in Eritrea, we have Kanu Station, which was perhaps the most critical site for signals intelligence for the United States military for many, many years. It has to do with the particularities of the geography and the clearness of the air on the smart plane, and it also it was at the same latitude as Crimea, where Russia was running their space program out of, and so it provided an excellent site for telemetric interception of Russian signals programs. And so I wanted to ask if anyone could speak to the relativity of sanctions to resentment over the loss of control of Kanu. And then maybe tomorrow we could dig in a little bit more into more current affairs and resentments over Eritrea's stalwart stance against AFRICOM.
Would anyone like to jump in and attempt to answer this question? Excellent question. Excellent question.
Yes, indeed, it was a good question. I hope our comrade from Asmara, Dr. Saleh Mahmoud, would weigh in on this. But briefly, I'll say that Kanyo station that you mentioned, Jeremy, was the quid pro quo that President Roosevelt reached with Emperor Haile Selassie on the ship off the coast of Egypt in 1945. The US, in the emerging Cold War, realized that Eritrea was strategically located, as you said, on the same longitude with Crimea and the Soviet Union's, communication. So they needed a communication base, and that was a strategic location. Of course, Eritrea's long Red Sea coast, whose southern tip also is controlling of that Bab el-Mandeb strait. There are strategic what are they called, choke points like that. Bab el-Mandeb in the Red Sea, and the other one now important is the Malacca for China, Indonesia, Philippines. So China, of course, has the Belt and Road Initiative, trying to bypass naval blockade on all that. And so at that time, the military base in Eritrea, which in fact was the largest in Africa, over 4,500 US soldiers, was important until its closure in the mid-1970s. At that time, the US moved from Canyo to the Diego, what are they called, the islands?
Diego Garcia.
Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. But declassified documents of the mid-1970s, after Nixon, during Gerald Ford administration, exposed that Kissinger was against that. He was adamant. We should not abandon Canyo, although the Congress was not, was not going to approve budgeting for it. It had to close and move it to the cheaper Diego Garcia, which would serve the same function. Kissinger, being the fox, whatever, strategist, so that this was an important area. We should not lose the strategic location, because if we lose it, the Soviets will take that. He argued. This is clearly in the declassified documents of National Security Council of the Gerald Ford administration. Eritrea, since the political programs of the EPLF, the first Congress, second Congress, during the national liberation struggle, clearly stated that it would not grant any military base to foreign forces. And so that, upon independence, Eritrea would not be looked favorably. Of course, when AFRICOM came, the new Africa Command, now Eritrea is the only country in Africa that does not have any relationship whatsoever with AFRICOM. This is another strike against it. And so it becomes, it's in the crosshairs of US sanctions and regime change agenda and all that. And this is, I think, what I can weigh in as far as, Eritrea resisting any kind of military intervention. You hear propaganda, though, Western media, as Gregor was saying, relentless demonization and inverting of the truth and the lie. That Eritrea is a very strange case. Eritrea at one time is supposed to have granted the Iranians base in the Dahlak Island. And at the same time, the Israelis have also military base in Eritrea. Doesn't anybody ask how is it that these two mortal enemies can coexist peacefully in Eritrea? Of course, it's a lie. Neither Iran nor Israel have military base in Eritrea. But then Western propaganda can make outrageous lie, and through sheer repetition and all kinds of shenanigans, machinations of propaganda, make the short-sighted, the public with short attention span not to ask the crucial questions.
May I say a few words regarding
Yes, please, thank you.
Yeah. Of course, Kanyo Station was a very important military base for the United States when it started after the unification of Eritrea with Ethiopia. But despite all this importance of the Kanyo Station, I think the hostilities of the United States against Eritrea is more than the Kanyo Station. The relevance of Kanyo Station, or the strategic importance that it had in the 1970s and 1960s, might not be still relevant at the time of now satellites and other alternative bases in the region for the United States. And if we assume that they are hostile against Eritrea because they lost the Kanyo Station, they lost the Kanyo Station at the hands of the Derg. So why they didn't support the Eritrean revolution, which was fighting against the Derg, who denied them the Kanyo Station? So I think the reason why they are against Eritrea is summarized by Dr. Muhammad Hassan very well. It's first of all, it's because of the policies of self-reliance, cooperation, and resilience that the Eritrean people and the government of Eritrea is following. They don't want the countries of the region to cooperate and to work together, while Eritrea is for the cooperation and for working together with the other countries. They don't want the principle or the policy of self-reliance because they want to keep the African countries live with their handouts. They don't want them to survive, to do their own projects and be independent from their sphere of influence. So I think Kanyo is a very small part of the equation when it comes to the policies of the United States. I'm sure even if another government comes to Eritrea and would like to give them Kanyo station back, I don't think they will stop their hostilities against Eritrea, given that the new government also will follow the policies of self-reliance, cooperation, and like all these things against imperialism. So while I appreciate the opinions of the participants regarding the importance of Kanyo Station, I think Kanyo Station is a very small thing today to the United States, and it could not be the main reason for their hostilities against the Eritrean people or the Eritrean nationhood. And as I have said it in my contribution earlier, the hostility against Eritrea has started even before Eritrea was an independent country, and even the United States get the Kanyo station. So it's beyond that. Thank you.
If we're to talk about, if just if I could just quickly jump in, if we're to talk about like the greatest threat, many Eritreans will cite, others who have talked about this, Noam Chomsky, others, the threat of a good example. And if you just look at mining, the mining industry, Eritrea is able to take 60% plus of the cut of profits, or not just profits, from royalties, profits, everything combined. It wants equal partnership when it comes to business and investment in Eritrea. And this kind of thinking is not very common in Africa when countries are not sovereign, when they don't fully express their sovereignty. And so because it has a self-reliant policy and not one of isolation and, we're better than this and that, it's to, walk into a to go into a deal, walk into a boardroom, cut a deal, and the deal is, good for the people of Eritrea. So you're seeing that being replicated on the continent. I know in Tanzania, they started negotiating better deals for their mining, their mining contracts. And so, and you didn't see that until Eritrea had kind of initiated that process. Even in the language, saying self-reliance, everyone knows Eritrea's been saying self-reliance since the early days of the struggle. So it continues, and that is, in my opinion, the real threat. And not just my opinion, but I think many who've spoken on this issue before me, that that kind of influence will grow in Africa. That you can go into the UN and be the only one who says, the only country in Africa who says, sanctions on Russia are not a good idea. To have an independent policy. So I agree that the Kanyo thing, it's old. It's no longer a central issue. With the changing of technology and all that stuff. It's really this software, this idea being pervasive in Africa through Eritrea.
Thank you again for your answers. Professor Nanopoulos, do you have any follow-up questions that you wanted to add as well?
I think I'm okay for now. If we have more opportunities to discuss the impacts, etc., tomorrow, maybe let's wait for the hearing tomorrow before I ask further questions. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you. And one last question from the audience. This is a question from Petros Demos. My apologies if I mispronounce your name. This is Petros's question. Quote, "My question is to Dr. Simon. I know that he has been one of the leaders of the No More movement that tried to create a platform for the global South to fight against the machinations of the United States and its allies. I would like to know what the current status is with that movement." So Dr. Simon Tissa, Mariam.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, although more at the current moment, we are really since November of last year when it was initiated, of 2021 when it was initiated. We saw censorship. We saw on Twitter. We saw, by the way, I should say that's the primary organizing medium at the time. We saw changes in Ethiopia. We saw changes in Somalia. As I mentioned earlier, setbacks, as well as in Sudan. And this is a time when we're going to, we're regrouping and reorganizing. And I think right now, the focus has to be on organization and organizing ourselves. But to do that, we have to significantly raise the consciousness of the peoples of the Horn of Africa. As Professor Mohammed Hassan has mentioned, this concept of a new Horn of Africa is truly seeing yourself as a Horn of African, and not just your ethnicity, not just your nation. Having we're proud of our countries, and we've gone through a lot. Our individual countries, our subnational identities that we have. We sometimes when you're under attack, you express them a little bit more, and but we have got to get to the point where we're looking beyond, we're thinking big. And so at this current moment, with these setbacks, it's kind of led to a bit of a retreat on this kind of thinking. And so we're going to have to build, and we currently are building. A lot of that is happening through forums like these, which is a forum, for the global South, and expressing the concept of no more. This is more focused on sanctions at the current moment, but we will certainly push no more, and even beyond the name no more. This idea of just anti-imperialism on the African continent, it is percolating at the current moment. You see it throughout the continent. People are angry at imperialism. And so in order to collect them in a space, in a common area, we have, this battle cry of saying no more. And so we'll continue to push it despite setbacks, and it will re-express itself in a new way. So don't be shy about saying no more. I suggest that you push it hard, you scream it at the top of your lungs. And it is, I also want to stress, people are trying to make it sound like it is a single leader, or, that, oh, this leader of this country or this singular person is saying this or that. It's not about personalities. I really want to stress that. So when people say, oh, I don't agree with no more because of this leader or that leader, it is not based on a leader. And so, but we have to go beyond just hashtags and move into the realm of organization. So that's coming.
Thank you so much. And in the spirit of Pan-Africanism and internationalism, I think that's a great way to end the first portion of the Eritrea hearing today. Thank you so much to Charlotte for the background work, to Jeremy for co-moderating, and special thank you for the witnesses as well. We look forward to continuing the Eritrea hearing tomorrow at the same time. And with that, everybody have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.